Don't let her take my baby!" The agonizing scream echoed through the marble halls of the Russo estate. Bridget, a plus-size maid who had always been invisible to the elite, clung to the mob boss's knees, sobbing for the infant torn from her arms. Dominic Russo, a man whose name struck terror from Chicago to New York, looked down at the woman who had secretly captured his heart. He drew his weapon, his eyes cold and lethal. "Nobody touches my son," he vowed. High on Tot Hill, overlooking the sprawling, gritty expanse of Staten Island, the Russo estate stood as a fortress of unimaginable wealth and deeply buried secrets. It was a world of imported Italian marble, baccarat chandeliers, and ruthlessness masked by tailored Brioni suits. In this world, Bridget Collins was supposed to be a ghost. At 240 pounds, with soft, generous curves and a quiet demeanor, Bridget had spent her entire 22 years apologizing for taking up space. She was a maid, hired specifically by the Russo family's head housekeeper, because her heavy-set frame and plain, unpolished beauty posed no threat to the vain, predatory women who orbited the mafia elite. Bridget was a South Boston girl who had taken the job to pay off her father's crippling debts to a local loan shark. She scrubbed floors, polished silver, and kept her head down. To the cartel bosses and their razor-thin, designer-clad wives, Bridget was merely part of the furniture. They mocked her when they thought she couldn't hear, whispering cruel jokes about the fat girl in the oversized uniform. But Bridget endured it, swallowing her tears, dreaming of the day her father's ledger would be wiped clean, and she could escape back to a quiet life. But everything changed on a freezing night in late October. Dominic Russo, the 34-year-old undisputed head of the Camorra syndicate in New York, was not a man who showed weakness. Feared for his icy demeanor and tactical brilliance, Dominic ruled his empire with an iron fist. But that night, an ambush outside Rao's restaurant in East Harlem had gone catastrophically wrong. Dominic managed to stagger through the back entrance of his estate, bypassing his security detail to avoid showing vulnerability to his soldiers. He collapsed in his private study, a bullet lodged deep in his shoulder. Bridget had been up late, quietly dusting the massive mahogany bookshelves. When the dawn crashed to the floor, bleeding onto the Persian rug, she didn't scream. Her survival instincts kicked in. While the rest of the mansion slept, the quiet, plus-size maid grabbed her first aid kit, a bottle of aged scotch and towels. She knelt beside the most dangerous man on the East Coast, her soft, trembling hands working with surprising efficiency to clean the wound and stem the bleeding. Dominic, hazy with pain, looked up at her. He didn't see a fat, invisible maid. He saw an angel with tear-streaked cheeks and a heart far too pure for the hell he lived in. For the first time in his life, the ruthless mafia boss felt truly safe. The adrenaline, the proximity, and the raw vulnerability of the night shifted something between them. When Dominic reached up with his uninjured arm and pulled her down to him, Bridget didn't pull away. In the quiet darkness of the study, he worshipped the very body she had spent her life hiding. He traced the soft swells of her hips and stomach, whispering gruff, fiercely tender praises against her skin, making her feel beautiful, desired, and deeply cherished. It was a single night of forbidden passion, a secret locked away the moment the sun rose. Bridget returned to her quarters, terrified of what she had done, while Dominic retreated behind his walls of ice, heavily guarded as a brutal turf war consumed his days. 2 months later, the morning sickness began. Bridget's heart shattered when the plastic stick showed 2 pink lines. A baby. She was carrying the heir to the Russo Empire. Panic consumed her. In the Mafia, illegitimate children were liabilities, and the women who carried them were often erased. Desperate, she packed her meager belongings into a single duffel bag, planning to flee to a secluded town in Maine. She made it as far as the estate's back gates before 2 massive suited enforcers stepped out of the shadows, blocking her path. They brought her directly to Dominic. When Bridget stood trembling in his office, she expected a bullet. She confessed, sobbing, bracing herself for the end. Instead, Dominic's cold eyes softened. He walked around his massive desk, gently took her face in his scarred hands, and wiped away her tears. He didn't order her death. He ordered her protection. Bridget was moved from the servants' quarters into a luxurious, heavily guarded suite in the East Wing. She was given everything: the finest food, silk maternity clothes, and top-tier prenatal care. But her elevation came with a terrifying complication. Dominic was engaged. Her name was Natalia Moretti. She was the daughter of the Chicago outfit's underboss, a striking, razor-thin socialite with a heart as black as coal. The marriage was a strategic alliance meant to unite the New York and Chicago families. Natalia was cruel, calculating, and, crucially, infertile, a secret known only to the highest ranks. When Natalia arrived at the Todd Hill estate to prepare for the upcoming wedding, she quickly noticed the heavy security around the East Wing. It didn't take long for her to uncover the truth. Natalia cornered Bridget one afternoon in the estate's gardens. The Chicago heiress looked the heavy-set maid up and down with absolute disgust. "You think a pig like you gets to keep the Russo heir?" Natalia had hissed, her manicured nails digging into Bridget's soft arm. "Dominic needs a legitimate son. He needs a queen, not a fat, lowly servant who scrubs toilets. Enjoy your little vacation, sweetheart. Because the second that bastard child is out of your body, you're dead, and the boy is mine." Bridget retreated to her room, trembling with terror. The golden cage had become a waiting room for her execution. Dominic swore he would protect her, but in a world governed by blood, alliances, and deception, Bridget knew that a whispered promise in the dark could easily be drowned out by the roar of mafia politics. She touched her growing belly, a fierce, primal maternal instinct rising over her lifelong timidity. She was no longer just the fat maid from Southie. She was a mother, and she would fight the devil herself to keep her child. The birth happened on the stormy Tuesday in April, cloaked in absolute secrecy. Dominic had arranged for an entire wing of Lenox Hill Hospital to be cleared out, staffed only by doctors on his payroll. When the first cries of baby Luca pierced the sterile air, Dominic Russo, a man who had watched empires fall and men bleed out without blinking, dropped to his knees beside Bridget's bed and wept. Luca was perfect. He had a tuft of dark hair and Dominic's piercing eyes, but he had Bridget's soft, gentle mouth. As Bridget held her son against her chest, her exhausted, sweat-dampened face glowing with maternal triumph, Dominic leaned down and kissed her forehead. "He's beautiful," Dominic murmured, his voice thick with emotion, just like his mother. But the bubble of peace was tragically short-lived. Returning to the Todd Hill estate meant returning to the viper's nest. Bridget was confined entirely to the nursery in the East Wing, her days spent rocking Luca and staring out the reinforced windows, dreading the sound of approaching footsteps. Dominic had doubled her guards, stationing his 2 most loyal men outside her door. But Bridget could feel the oppressive, venomous presence of Natalia Moretti seeping through the walls. Natalia's wedding to Dominic was only weeks away. The alliance with Chicago was critical. A rival faction was making aggressive moves on the docks, and the Russo family needed the outfit's muscle to survive. Natalia knew Dominic's hands were tied by duty. She also knew that a mafia boss without a legitimate heir was vulnerable. She had already begun planting seeds of doubt among the capos, subtly suggesting that the Don was distracted by a pathetic obsession with a morbidly obese servant, making him look weak. Natalia's endgame was simple and ruthless. Wait until the wedding, formally adopt the boy as her own, to solidify her status as the untouchable mafia matriarch, and have Bridget quietly disposed of in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. A tragic accident, they would say. Postpartum depression leading to a fatal overdose. The opportunity presented itself far sooner than Natalia anticipated. In late May, an emergency sit-down was called at the Borgata in Atlantic City. The heads of the 5 families demanded Dominic's presence to mediate a brutal dispute over union contracts. It was a summit Dominic could not refuse, nor could he postpone. Before leaving, he held Bridget tightly, his forehead resting against hers. "Lock the doors. Do not let anyone in but my 2 men. I will be back in 48 hours, he commanded, his eyes filled with a desperate anxiety that terrified her. The moment Dominic's armored Cadillac Escalade disappeared down the winding driveway, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted. The silence became predatory. It was 2 a.m. on the second night of Dominic's absence when Bridget awoke to a chilling sound. A heavy, muted thud echoed from the hallway outside the nursery. Then another. Bridget's blood ran cold. She scrambled out of bed, her large frame moving with surprising speed as she rushed to the heavy oak door. She pressed her ear against the wood. Silence. Not even the quiet murmurs of Dominic's loyal guards. Suddenly, the lock clicked. The door flew open, hitting the wall with a deafening crack. Natalia stepped into the dimly lit nursery, flanked by 3 massive, unfamiliar men, wearing dark suits and leather gloves. Chicago enforcers. Natalia was dressed in a pristine white silk robe, a vicious, triumphant smile twisting her beautiful face. "Time's up, piggy," Natalia purred, her eyes darting to the crib where little Luca was sleeping peacefully. "Get out!" Bridget screamed, backing up and putting her heavy body directly between the men and the crib. "Dominic will kill you. He'll kill all of you." Natalia laughed, a sharp, grating sound. "Dominic is in Atlantic City. By the time he gets back, my men will have dumped your oversized carcass in a landfill, and little Luca here will be safe in his new mother's arms. I'm doing the family a favor. A future Don can't have a fat, disgusting maid for a mother. He needs royalty. Take another step and I'll tear your throat out," Bridget snarled. The timid, apologetic girl was gone. In her place was a mother backed into a corner. She grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the changing table, gripping it like a club. Natalia rolled her eyes. "Grab the baby. Handle the cow." 2 of the enforcers lunged forward. Bridget swung the heavy lamp with all her might, smashing it into the jaw of the first man. He grunted, stumbling back, but the second man tackled her. Bridget's size, which had always been a source of shame, became her greatest weapon. She threw her 240 pounds into the attacker, slamming him against the wall and clawing frantically at his face. She fought like a wild animal, fueled by sheer adrenaline and absolute terror. But she was outnumbered. The first man recovered and struck her hard across the back of the head with the butt of his pistol. Bridget crumpled to the floor, her vision exploding into white-hot sparks. Pain radiated through her skull, draining the strength from her limbs. Through blurred, tear-filled eyes, she saw Natalia walk gracefully to the crib. The heiress reached in and lifted the suddenly crying infant. Luca wailed, sensing the cold, foreign hands holding him. "No, please," Bridget choked out, crawling agonizingly across the carpet, her fingers reaching out. "Don't let her take my baby. Please, God, no." Natalia looked down at her with pure disdain. "Finish her," she commanded the enforcer, aiming his gun at Bridget's head. Bridget squeezed her eyes shut, sobbing helplessly as she waited for the fatal shot, her heart breaking not for herself, but for her son, who would be raised by a monster. "Don't let her take my baby!" Bridget cried out one last time, an agonizing scream that echoed through the marble halls. Suddenly, a deafening gunshot shattered the nursery window, but it hadn't come from the enforcer. The man standing over Bridget dropped dead, a bullet hole perfectly centered in his forehead. The heavy oak doors of the nursery were kicked entirely off their hinges. Dominic Russo stood in the doorway, drenched in rain, chest heaving, a silenced assault rifle gripped in his hands. He hadn't stayed in Atlantic City. He had trusted his gut and flown a private helicopter back through the storm. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, were blazing with a demonic, unhinged fury. Natalia froze, the baby clutched awkwardly in her arms. The remaining 2 Chicago enforcers reached for their weapons, but Dominic fired twice in rapid succession. Both men dropped to the floor, lifeless. Dominic stepped over the bodies, his gaze locked onto Natalia. He lowered the rifle and drew his handgun, leveling it directly at the heiress's face. "Dominic, darling, listen," Natalia stammered, her arrogant facade crumbling into absolute panic. "Nobody touches my son," Dominic vowed, his voice a low, lethal growl that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. He stepped forward, the gun unwavering. "And nobody touches the woman I love." The heavy silence in the nursery was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the shattered window panes and the frantic, gasping cries of baby Luca. Dominic Russo stood like a statue of vengeance, his tailored suit completely soaked, his dark hair plastered against his forehead. The gun in his hand did not waver a single millimeter from Natalia Moretti's pristine, terrified face. The heiress, who had walked into the room radiating the untouchable arrogance of Chicago royalty, now trembled so violently that her silk robe fluttered around her dangerously thin frame. "Dominic, you don't understand," Natalia stammered, her voice pitching into a shrill, desperate whine. She held the wailing infant awkwardly, holding him out like a human shield. "She attacked my men. This fat pig was going to hurt the baby. I was protecting your heir." "Shut your mouth," Dominic commanded, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried the terrifying weight of a death sentence. "Hand me my son, slowly. If you trip, if you stumble, if you even breathe too heavily on him, I will put a bullet through your left eye. Do you understand me, Natalia?" Whimpering, the Chicago underboss's daughter took 2 agonizingly slow steps forward. Dominic snatched Luca from her grasp with his free hand, his entire demeanor shifting the millisecond the boy was securely against his chest. The lethal, cold-blooded Don vanished, replaced instantly by a fiercely protective father. He turned his gaze to the floor, where Bridget lay battered and gasping for air. Dominic holstered his weapon and dropped to his knees beside the heavy-set maid. He cradled Luca in one arm and used the other to gently lift Bridget's head. His scarred fingers tenderly brushed the matted, blood-soaked hair away from her pale face. "Bridget," he murmured, his voice cracking with a raw, unshielded emotion that the criminal underworld had never witnessed. "I've got him. He's safe. You're safe. I'm right here. Bridget looked up through swollen eyes, her large, soft hands trembling as she reached for her baby. Dominic carefully placed Luca against her chest. The moment the infant felt the familiar, pillowy warmth of his mother, his cries subsided into exhausted hiccups. Bridget buried her face in the baby's soft neck, sobbing uncontrollably. She had fought with everything she had, throwing her heavy frame against hardened killers, fully expecting to die. Now, enveloped in Dominic's strong embrace, the adrenaline crashed, leaving her utterly drained. "You killed them," Natalia hissed from the corner of the room, her shock finally giving way to venomous rage as she stared at the lifeless bodies of her Chicago enforcers. "Do you have any idea what you've just done, Dominic? My father is Salvatore Moretti. He controls the entire Midwest. You break our engagement. You murder his top soldiers. He will rain hellfire on New York. He will slaughter your entire syndicate just to make an example out of you. And for what? For a morbidly obese servant who cleans toilets." Dominic rose to his feet, his towering frame casting a long, dark shadow over the room. He walked slowly toward Natalia, his boots crunching over the shattered glass. He didn't yell. He didn't strike her. Instead, he leaned in close, his face inches from hers. "Your father is a dying old man, sitting in a mansion in the Gold Coast, living off past glory," Dominic said softly. "You think you can come into my home on Tot Hill and threaten my family? You thought I would marry a barren, treacherous snake just to secure a few shipping routes on the Great Lakes? You gravely miscalculated, Natalia. You are not leaving this island." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a secure encrypted satellite phone. He dialed a single number. "Arthur," Dominic barked into the receiver, calling upon his most ruthless and loyal capo, Arthur Dempsey. "Get a cleanup crew to the East Wing nursery immediately. Then prepare the bunker beneath the wine cellar. We have a permanent guest." Natalia's eyes widened in absolute horror. "No, you can't hold me hostage. My father will destroy you." "Let him try," Dominic replied coldly. Two of Dominic's surviving guards rushed into the room, their weapons drawn, completely bewildered by the carnage. "Take her downstairs," Dominic ordered, gesturing to the screaming heiress. "Strip her of her phones, her jewelry, everything. Lock her in the vault. If she screams, gag her." As the guards dragged a kicking, hysterical Natalia out of the nursery, Dominic turned back to Bridget. He knelt beside her again, wrapping his arms around her fluid, soft waist, pulling both her and the baby into his lap. He didn't care about the blood soaking into his expensive suit. He didn't care about the impending mafia war that would undoubtedly tear the East Coast apart. All he cared about was the woman shivering in his arms. "You came back," Bridget whispered, her voice hoarse, her tears soaking into his collar. "You were supposed to be at the Borgata. You were supposed to be making peace with the 5 families." "There is no peace without you, Bridget," Dominic said fiercely, kissing her bruised cheek. "I sat in that boardroom in Atlantic City, surrounded by the most powerful men in the country, and all I could think about was you. I knew Natalia was making a move. I felt it in my gut. I left the summit, commandeered a chopper from Teterboro Airport, and flew through a lightning storm, because the only empire I give a damn about is sitting right here in my arms." Bridget looked into his dark, intense eyes, her heart pounding against her ribs. "They will never accept me, Dominic. The Commission, your capos, the other families. I am a maid from Southie. I'm fat, I'm plain. I have no pedigree. They will view me as a weakness. They will use me to tear you down." Dominic cupped her face, his thumbs tracing the soft curves of her jawline. Listen to me carefully, he vowed, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. You are not plain. You are the most beautiful, courageous woman I have ever known. You threw yourself in front of a bullet for our son tonight. You fought like a lioness. The men in my world respect one thing above all else: loyalty and strength. You have more of both in your little finger than Natalia Moretti has in her entire hollow soul. Let them whisper. Let them start a war. By the time I am finished, every boss from New York to Chicago will bow their heads when they speak your name. You are not a maid anymore, Bridget. You are going to be my wife. The heavy oak table at the back of the social club in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, was clouded with thick cigar smoke and the suffocating tension of impending doom. It had been exactly 4 days since the bloodbath in the Tot Hill nursery. The news of Dominic Russo's broken engagement and the absolute disappearance of Natalia Moretti had sent shockwaves through the American underworld. In Chicago, Salvatore Moretti had completely lost his mind. The aging, ruthless don of the outfit had immediately grounded all commercial flights out of O'Hare for his top lieutenants, chartering private jets to move heavily armed hit squads into the tri-state area. Dominic's empire was on high alert. The Russo estate had been transformed into a militarized fortress. Armed sentries patrolled the perimeter with attack dogs. The iron gates were reinforced with concrete barricades, and sniper teams were positioned on the mansion's roof. Inside, Bridget was kept under constant surveillance, moved from the compromised nursery to the master suite in the heavily armored West Wing. But a fortress is only as strong as the men guarding it. Arthur Dempsey, Dominic's trusted capo, and a man who had sworn a blood oath to the Russo family, was pacing nervously in the alleyway behind a butcher shop in Little Italy. Arthur had always been a pragmatist. He looked at the situation objectively. Dominic had lost his mind over a plus-size servant girl. To Arthur, starting a multi-billion-dollar syndicate war over a woman who used to scrub the estate's baseboards was not just bad business. It was a death sentence for them all. Chicago had vastly superior numbers, and the heads of the New York Commission had secretly decided to turn a blind eye, effectively sanctioning Dominic's assassination to avoid a nationwide mafia conflict. When a black Lincoln town car rolled into the alley, Arthur stepped forward. The window rolled down, revealing the cold, dead eyes of Gianni, Chicago's most prolific and terrifying hitman. Gianni handed Arthur a thick manila envelope containing $2 million in untraceable bearer bonds. "Is the back gate schedule handled?" Gianni asked, his voice like grinding stones. "Shift change is at exactly 3 a.m., Arthur replied, his hands shaking slightly as he took the envelope. "The security cameras on the north perimeter will experience a technical glitch for a 5-minute window. That's your entry point. The Don is sleeping in the West Wing master suite. The girl and the baby are with him. Do it quietly. I want the syndicate intact when I take over tomorrow morning." Gianni simply nodded and rolled up the window. The betrayal was sealed. At 3 a.m., a brutal, freezing rain washed over Staten Island. Inside the master suite, Bridget lay awake, staring at the ornate ceiling. Luca was sleeping in a bassinet beside the massive king-sized bed. Dominic was asleep beside her, his arm draped heavily over her generous waist, his pistol resting on the nightstand within inches of his hand. Even in sleep, he guarded her. Bridget gently stroked his dark hair, marveling at the terrifying, beautiful reality of her life. She was no longer hiding in the shadows. She was the heart of the Russo family. But the quiet peace was shattered by the faint, muffled sound of a suppressed gunshot from the courtyard below. Dominic's eyes snapped open. He was instantly awake, operating on pure, lethal instinct. He grabbed the pistol from the nightstand, rolling off the bed and pulling Bridget to the floor in one fluid motion. "Stay low," he whispered, his eyes scanning the darkness. Before Bridget could process the panic, the heavy oak doors of the master suite were blown off their hinges by a concussive breaching charge. The room filled with blinding smoke and the deafening roar of automatic gunfire. Dominic returned fire instantly, his bullets finding the shadows in the doorway. 2 of the Chicago hitmen dropped, but more were pouring into the hallway. "The panic room! Now!" Dominic roared over the gunfire, shoving Bridget toward the concealed reinforced steel door behind the walk-in closet. Bridget grabbed Luca from the bassinet, shielding the crying infant with her large, soft body as she scrambled across the floor. She hit the biometric scanner, and the heavy steel door slid open. She threw herself inside, turning back to see Dominic pinned down behind a marble pillar, wildly outgunned by Gianni and 4 other heavily armed assassins. "Dominic!" Bridget screamed, her heart tearing in half. "Close the door, Bridget! Keep him safe!" Dominic yelled, slapping a fresh magazine into his weapon and laying down a blanket of suppressing fire. The heavy steel door slid shut with a finalized, terrifying thud, locking Bridget and the baby in a perfectly soundproof, concrete-lined cube. The security monitors flickered to life on the wall, showing the horrifying reality of the situation. The entire estate had been breached. Arthur's betrayal had allowed dozens of Chicago soldiers inside. Dominic was fighting like a demon, but he was trapped in the hallway, slowly being surrounded. Bridget stared at the monitors, panic threatening to consume her. She was supposed to stay in the panic room and wait for the police or loyal reinforcements. That was the protocol. But as she watched the screens, she realized that Dominic was going to die. Chicago had cut the power to the main communications array. Help was not coming. She looked down at her sleeping son, then at her own trembling hands. She remembered Natalia's cruel words. "A morbidly obese servant who cleans toilets. I am not just a maid," Bridget thought, a fierce, protective rage igniting in her chest. "I know this house better than anyone." For 2 years, Bridget had cleaned every inch of the massive, historic Todd Hill estate. She knew its secrets. Built in the 1920s during Prohibition by a wealthy bootlegger, the mansion was riddled with hidden servant corridors, narrow, unmapped passageways designed so the staff could move unseen. There was an access hatch to one of these corridors, located right behind the ventilation grate in the panic room. Bridget set Luca down in a secure, padded lockbox designed for infants. She kissed his forehead. "Mummy's going to save Daddy," she whispered. Using a heavy wrench from the emergency toolkit, Bridget unscrewed the ventilation grate. The space was tight, claustrophobic, and entirely pitch black. For a woman of her size, squeezing into the hidden servant passage was agonizing. The rough stone scraped against her arms and hips, tearing her silk nightgown and bruising her soft skin. But she didn't care. She pushed forward with primal desperation, navigating the dusty, forgotten tunnels by memory alone. She crawled through the darkness, following the muffled sounds of gunfire echoing through the walls. She knew exactly where the tunnel exited, a hidden panel directly behind the grand staircase on the 2nd floor, perfectly flanking the hallway where Gianni's men had Dominic pinned down. Bridget reached the panel. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding like a war drum. She wasn't a trained killer. She was a mother from South Boston. But tonight, she was going to change the balance of power in the American mafia. She gripped the heavy iron wrench tightly in her hand, braced her heavy frame against the wood, and kicked the hidden panel completely off the wall. The antique oak paneling splintered with a deafening, violent crack. Bridget exploded from the hidden servants' passageway, a 240-pound force of pure maternal fury, covered in suffocating plaster dust and torn silk. The remaining Chicago hitmen, entirely focused on laying down a relentless barrage of suppressing fire to keep the terrifying Russo Don pinned behind a marble pillar, never even registered the breach behind them until it was entirely too late. Bridget did not hesitate. The timid girl who had spent her life shrinking away from confrontation was dead, buried in the dark tunnels of the estate. In her place was a mother protecting her child. She raised the heavy iron wrench with both hands, channeling every ounce of her fear and rage, and brought it down with crushing force onto the collarbone of the rearmost assassin. The man shrieked, a horrific sound that cut through the echoing gunfire, his assault rifle clattering uselessly to the polished hardwood floor as his shoulder completely caved in. He dropped to his knees, utterly incapacitated. The sudden, agonizing scream shattered the tight tactical formation of the Chicago squad. Gianni, the cold-blooded veteran leader of the hit team, spun around. For a fraction of a second, his famously dead eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated shock. He had expected a fully armed, heavily armored New York tactical response team to flank them. Instead, he saw a disheveled, heavily bruised, plus-size woman in a ruined nightgown, wielding a bloody wrench like an avenging Valkyrie. That fraction of a second was all Dominic Russo needed. The moment the suppressing fire faltered, the Don moved with the terrifying speed and lethal precision that had made him the most feared man on the East Coast. He broke cover from behind the decimated marble pillar, sliding across the blood-slicked floor. He fired 3 times in rapid succession. The shots were perfectly placed. 2 of Gianni's remaining men caught bullets directly in their throats, collapsing instantly in a spray of crimson. Gianni realized the fight was lost. Operating on pure malice, the Chicago assassin swung his weapon away from Dominic and leveled it directly at Bridget's chest, determined to inflict maximum pain on the Russo family before his own demise. "Bridget, get down!" Dominic roared, his voice tearing at his vocal cords. Bridget threw her heavy frame to the side, hitting the floor hard just as Gianni pulled the trigger. The bullets tore through the air where she had been standing a millisecond prior, shattering a priceless Ming vase against the far wall. Before Gianni could adjust his aim, Dominic was upon him. The mob boss didn't just shoot the assassin. He tackled him with the force of a freight train. The 2 men crashed through the ornate wooden railing of the second-floor landing, plummeting onto the grand foyer's Persian rug below. Bridget scrambled to the edge of the shattered balcony, her heart in her throat. She looked down to see Dominic straddling the dazed hitman. Dominic drove his fist into Gianni's face once, twice, 3 times, reducing the legendary assassin to a broken, unmoving heap. For a moment, the estate fell deathly silent, save for the crackle of a small fire that had started near the shattered double doors. Dominic stood up slowly, his chest heaving, his tailored suit completely ruined, his knuckles raw and bleeding. He looked up at the balcony. When he saw Bridget peering over the edge, bruised but alive, the lethal monster vanished from his eyes. "Luca," Dominic rasped, his voice trembling. "He's in the panic room. He's safe," Bridget called down, tears of profound relief finally streaming down her dust-streaked cheeks. Within minutes, the wail of sirens and the roar of armored SUVs filled the courtyard. Dominic's loyal street soldiers, led by a fiercely loyal capo named Thomas Kelly, had finally breached the compromised gates, overwhelming the remaining Chicago lookouts. The mansion was secured. Thomas rushed into the grand foyer, his assault rifle drawn, surveying the absolute carnage. He looked at the bodies of the elite Chicago hit squad, then up at Bridget, who was slowly walking down the grand staircase, holding little Luca tightly to her chest. "Boss, the perimeter is locked down," Thomas reported, breathless. "But the security feeds, they were deliberately cut from the inside. Someone gave them the shift schedules. Someone opened the north gate." Dominic took his son from Bridget, kissing the baby's forehead before wrapping his free arm securely around Bridget's wide waist, pulling her flush against his side. His eyes darkened with a cold, calculating fury. "Arthur Dempsey," Dominic said quietly. He was the only one who knew the exact timing of the perimeter shifts tonight. "Find him. Do not kill him. Bring him to the cellar." They didn't have to look far. Arthur Dempsey was apprehended 10 minutes later, attempting to flee the island in an unmarked sedan with a duffel bag full of untraceable bearer bonds. He was dragged back into the estate, bloody and bound, and thrown onto the stone floor of the subterranean wine cellar. Dominic stood over the traitorous capo, Bridget remaining steadfast by his side. She refused to look away. She was done hiding. Arthur spat blood onto the cobblestones, glaring up at them. "You're a fool, Dominic," Arthur sneered, though fear quivered in his voice. "The Commission gave Chicago the green light. You think you can survive a war against the entire Midwest over this fat cow? She's a maid. She's nothing. You're tearing the family apart for a piece of trash." Dominic didn't yell. He drew his pistol and calmly racked the slide. But before he could aim, Bridget stepped forward. She looked down at the man who had just tried to orchestrate the murder of her child. Her voice, usually soft and apologetic, was cold as ice. "I might have been a maid, Arthur," Bridget said, her tone dripping with a terrifying newfound authority. "But I just fought through a hit squad to save this family, while you sold it out like a coward. You are the trash." Dominic looked at Bridget, a profound, awe-struck pride washing over his features. He handed her the heavy pistol. "The Queen passes the sentence," Dominic said softly, yielding the ultimate authority to the woman he loved. Bridget took the gun. Her hands didn't shake. She pointed it directly at Arthur's chest. "Tell the devil the maid sent you," she whispered. The gunshot echoed endlessly through the dark cellar, sealing Bridget's absolute transformation from a frightened servant into the undeniable matriarch of the Russo Empire. The acrid scent of cordite lingered in the air 3 hours after the assault, mingling with the smell of strong black coffee brewing in the mansion's fortified war room. The Todd Hill estate had survived the night, but the war was far from over. By dawn, the bodies of the Chicago hitmen had been discreetly disposed of, but the political fallout was a ticking time bomb. Salvatore Moretti, the ruthless don of the Chicago outfit, would soon realize his elite squad had failed. Dominic sat at the head of the massive mahogany conference table, his loyal capo, Thomas Kelly, and his top lieutenants flanking him. Bridget sat directly at Dominic's right hand. Nobody questioned her presence. After word spread of how she had single-handedly neutralized a heavily armed assassin and executed the traitorous Arthur Dempsey, the men in the room looked at the plus-size woman with profound, reverent respect. She was wearing a beautifully tailored dark green wrap dress that accentuated her generous curves, her hair pinned up elegantly, the bruises on her face serving as a crown of combat. "We have a monumental problem, boss," Thomas said, tracing a map of the East Coast on the table. "Salvatore has the numbers. If he launches a full-scale invasion, we can hold Staten Island, but we'll lose the Brooklyn docks, the Manhattan casinos, and the Jersey shipping routes. Furthermore, the New York Commission is wavering. If they think Salvatore is justified in his revenge because you broke the engagement and kidnapped his daughter, they will officially sanction our extermination. Dominic rubbed his temples, exhaustion pulling at his scarred face. We need leverage. We need to fracture Salvatore's alliance with the Commission before he can marshal his forces. Bridget, who had been quietly reading through the tactical reports, placed a blood-stained piece of paper on the table. It was a folded directive she had pulled from the pocket of Gianni, the dead hitman, while Thomas's men were cleaning the foyer. I already found our leverage, Bridget said calmly. Dominic picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the Italian text. His jaw clenched, a low whistle escaping his lips. He handed it to Thomas. Thomas read it aloud, his voice thick with disbelief. Objective: terminate Dominic Russo, the woman, and the child. Secondary objective: terminate Natalia Moretti in the crossfire. Ensure it looks like Russo's men killed her. Use her death to unify the Midwest and force the New York Commission's hand. A heavy, stunned silence fell over the war room. Salvatore ordered a hit on his own flesh and blood, Dominic whispered, the sheer depravity of the act settling over the room. In the Mafia, blood was sacred. To orchestrate the murder of your own daughter solely to manufacture a casus belli for a turf war was a violation of the deepest, most sacred underworld laws. Bridget stood up, her presence commanding the room. If the Commission sees this, Salvatore loses everything. His own capos in Chicago will turn on him. But a piece of paper isn't enough. Gianni is dead. They will say we forged it. So what do we do? Thomas asked, looking directly at Bridget, fully acknowledging her as a strategist. We show them the paper, Bridget replied, a sharp, brilliant glint in her eyes. And we let the hostage do the talking. 10 minutes later, Dominic and Bridget descended into the deepest level of the estate, the reinforced subterranean vault. Inside, surrounded by concrete walls, Natalia Moretti sat huddled on a velvet cot. The Chicago heiress looked entirely shattered. Her pristine white silk robe was stained, her hair a tangled mess. When the heavy steel door swung open, she looked up, her eyes wide with terror, expecting Dominic to finally put a bullet in her head in retaliation for the night's attack. Instead, Bridget walked in alone, while Dominic stood silently in the doorway. Natalia shrank back, her arrogance warring with her current reality. "What do you want?" she spat, though her voice shook. "Are you here to beg for your life before my father's men breach the vault?" Bridget didn't raise her voice. She walked calmly over to the cot and dropped the blood-stained orders directly onto Natalia's lap. "Read it," Bridget commanded. Natalia's trembling hands picked up the paper. As her eyes scanned her father's seal and the undeniable cold-blooded orders to have her slaughtered, all the color drained from her face. She read it 3 times, her breathing turning shallow and frantic. "No," she gasped, tears spilling over her mascara-stained cheeks. "No, this is a forgery. My father wouldn't. He needs me to be the Queen of New York." "Your father doesn't want you to be a queen, Natalia. He wants you to be a martyr," Bridget said, offering only cold, hard truth. "He sent Gianni. You know Gianni's reputation. He leaves no witnesses. You were collateral damage in a land grab for the Brooklyn docks." Natalia dropped the paper, burying her face in her hands as a guttural, heartbroken sob ripped from her throat. The untouchable, cruel socialite was broken, realizing she had been nothing but a pawn. Bridget sat down on the edge of the cot. She offered a lifeline. You have a choice. You can stay loyal to a man who just tried to put a bullet in your head. Or you can walk upstairs, sit in front of a camera, and read those orders aloud to the New York Commission and your father's capos. You tell them the truth." Natalia looked up, her eyes red and feral. "If I do this, he's a dead man. Chicago will eat him alive." "And you get to live," Dominic interjected, stepping into the light. "You help us end this war before it starts, and I will personally guarantee your safe passage to Europe with enough money to disappear forever." Natalia looked between the terrifying New York Don and the plus-size former maid who had completely usurped her throne. She realized Bridget was a brilliant tactician who held all the cards. "Give me the camera," Natalia whispered venomously. "I want to watch his empire burn." A few hours later, a secure, encrypted video file was broadcast to the heads of the 5 families and the Chicago outfit. It featured Natalia Moretti, looking broken but utterly furious, holding the assassination orders and detailing her father's treacherous plot to slaughter his own daughter for profit. The fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic. Within 12 hours, the New York Commission unanimously revoked Chicago's operating rights in the East. Worse, Salvatore's own underbosses, disgusted by the flagrant violation of Mafia Code, staged a bloody coup. Salvatore Moretti was found dead in his study, effectively ending the war before a single Chicago boot could march on New York soil. That evening, the Todd Hill estate was quiet. The broken glass had been swept away, the barricades slightly lowered. Bridget stood on the balcony of the master suite. Looking out over the glittering skyline of the city, she now quietly co-ruled. She felt strong arms wrap securely around her soft waist from behind, pulling her back into a broad, solid chest. Dominic kissed the crook of her neck, inhaling her scent. "The commission formally recognized my new consigliere today," he murmured softly against her skin. "They were surprisingly eager to accept my terms after you orchestrated the fall of the Midwest." Bridget leaned back against him, a soft, confident smile touching her lips. "I told you, Dominic. I clean up messes. It's what I do best." 6 months later, the biting winds of November swept through the streets of Manhattan. But inside the legendary private wine cellar of Il Mulino in Greenwich Village, the atmosphere was suffocatingly hot. The exclusive subterranean room, famously reserved for the city's untouchable elite, was packed with the remaining heads of the New York Commission. They had gathered for the most critical sit-down of the decade. The Russo family had emerged from the brief, bloody conflict with Chicago, stronger and wealthier than ever, effectively absorbing the Midwest's shipping routes. But power in the Mafia was a fragile illusion, and the old-school capos were uneasy. Dominic Russo sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table, immaculate in a charcoal Tom Ford suit. But it was the woman sitting at his right hand who commanded the room's undivided, albeit skeptical, attention. Bridget Collins was no longer a ghost. She wore a custom-tailored, deep burgundy suit that perfectly hugged her heavy, generous curves. Her thick hair was styled in sleek, cascading waves, and a flawless 2-carat diamond rested on her finger. She had fully embraced her 240-pound frame, radiating a quiet, dangerous confidence that unsettled the hardened criminals surrounding her. Carmine Falco, the aging, notoriously traditional boss of the Genovese faction, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He lit a thick Cuban cigar, exhaling the smoke deliberately toward Bridget. "We respect you, Dominic," Carmine rumbled, his voice like grinding gravel. "You handled the Chicago mess with precision. But this is highly irregular. A woman sitting in on a commission vote? And not just any woman. A former maid, A girl who used to wash our plates and fetch our coats. I don't care how many hitmen she brained with a wrench. It makes us look weak. It makes you look distracted. The room went dead silent. Thomas Kelly, standing behind Dominic, tensed, his hand inching toward his holstered weapon. Dominic's eyes went dark, a lethal fury sparking in his gaze. But before he could speak, Bridget gently placed her soft, manicured hand over his. She stopped him. This was her battle to fight. Bridget stood up slowly. She didn't shrink under the collective glare of the most dangerous men in America. She walked gracefully around the table, her presence commanding and absolute. She stopped directly behind Carmine's chair. "You're right, Carmine," Bridget said, her voice smooth, calm, and terrifyingly steady. "I was just a maid. For 2 years I was completely invisible to you. I emptied your ashtrays. I refilled your scotch glasses when you held private meetings in Dominic's study. And because you all looked right past the fat girl in the uniform, you didn't care what you said in front of me." She reached into her designer leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder, tossing it onto the table in front of the Genovese boss. "I know about the $3 million you've been quietly siphoning from the sanitation unions into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands," Bridget continued, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I know about the private apartment on the Upper East Side where you keep your 22-year-old mistress, financed entirely by family money. And most importantly, I know that you secretly met with Salvatore Moretti 2 weeks before the hit on Todd Hill, promising him your neutrality if he managed to kill Dominic." Carmine Falco turned deathly pale. The cigar dropped from his trembling fingers, burning a hole into the expensive linen tablecloth. The other bosses at the table shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing the terrifying magnitude of the woman standing before them. She wasn't just a survivor. She was an apex predator who had weaponized her former invisibility. "You want to talk about weakness, Carmine?" Bridget asked, leaning down so her face was inches from his. "Weakness is underestimating the people who clean up your messes. Dominic rules New York through strength and loyalty. I rule it through knowing every single one of your secrets. If you ever question my place at this table again, that folder goes to the federal prosecutor, and your wife gets the keys to the Upper East Side apartment. Do we have an understanding?" Carmine swallowed hard, the arrogance entirely drained from his aging face. He looked at the folder, then up at Bridget's unyielding eyes. "Yes, Mrs. Russo," he choked out. "We have an understanding." Dominic watched her from the head of the table, a smile of pure, untamed pride playing on his lips. The meeting concluded shortly after, the newly forged peace treaty signed without another word of dissent. Bridget had not just earned her seat at the table, she had conquered it. 3 weeks later, on a crisp, snow-dusted Saturday, the sprawling, manicured grounds of Oheka Castle on Long Island were completely locked down. Federal agents and local police were kept miles away by a wall of high-priced private security and loyal Russo enforcers. Inside the grand ballroom, beneath crystal baccarat chandeliers and thousands of white roses, Dominic and Bridget were finally getting married. There were no rival bosses invited, no mafia politics at play. It was a fiercely private ceremony for their closest, most trusted family. Bridget looked breathtaking. She wore a custom-designed silk and lace gown that celebrated every inch of her plus-size body, flowing elegantly over her wide hips and cinching perfectly at her waist. She walked down the aisle to the soft strings of a cello, her heart overflowing with an unbelievable joy. Thomas Kelly stood at the altar holding little Luca, who babbled happily, wearing a miniature tuxedo that perfectly matched his father's. When Bridget reached the end of the aisle, Dominic took both of her hands in his. The scarred, ruthless mafia boss had tears in his eyes as he looked down at the woman who had saved his life, saved his son, and transformed his empire when they tried to take our son from you. I made a vow, Dominic whispered, his voice thick with emotion, echoing through the silent, reverent hall. I swore that nobody would touch my family. But you didn't just let me protect you, Bridget. You stood up, you fought the wolves, and you protected me. You are my heart, you are my queen, and I am yours in this life and the next. Bridget smiled, tears of absolute happiness spilling over her cheeks. I love you, Dominic, always. As they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the heavy golden cage of the mafia melted away. Bridget was no longer the invisible, oversized maid hiding in the shadows of Todd Hill. She was Bridget Russo, the untouchable matriarch of New York, a fierce mother, a devoted wife, and a woman who had proven that true power doesn't come from fear. It comes from the fierce, unbreakable strength of a mother's love. What a breathtaking finale. From scrubbing floors to single-handedly ruling the New York mafia, Bridget's journey proves that a mother's love is the most dangerous weapon in the world. Did you expect the quiet, plus-size maid to completely outsmart the oldest bosses in the syndicate? Let us know your favorite moment from Bridget and Dominic's epic romance in the comments below. If you loved this thrilling story of loyalty, betrayal, and fierce mafia drama, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel